Hello, everyone. Terrence here with Hollywood Already Did It. I have finally seen the second filmed adaptation of Roald Dahl's book, The Witches, this time directed by Robert Zemeckis, starring Anne Hathaway, Octavia Spencer, Stanley Tucci, and narrated by Chris Rock. And I'll give you my thoughts and review right after the jump. Real quick, if you haven't already, go ahead and like, share, subscribe to the channel, ring that bell below. Anytime we have something, you will be among the first to know. So let me start off by saying this. I don't mind remakes. I know title of the channel says Hollywood Already Did. It seems like it's being a little bit negative towards remakes. I think remakes are part of everyday life. I think Broadway would not exist if you weren't allowed to do the same stories over and over and over again. That's just the way it goes. I do have a problem if these remakes are taking the place of original content. There should be a tit for tat. They should both exist. So let me just say that I don't have a problem with remakes, and I was looked forward to this film existing and kind of bringing the '90s version with Angelica Houston up to a new age. Let me say this: that Angelica Houston one is a fan favorite of mine. I love it. I know it didn't do well, but it became sort of a cult classic. But the reason why that works is that it was creepy. It was creepy as hell. That the using the practical effects, the Jim Henson production company with makeup and actual animatronics and all the makeup creatures and all that stuff, it worked. It still looked creepy. And a thing that happens with using practical effects versus CGI is that it doesn't get as dated as quickly. It still holds the test of time. You watch that '90s Witches now with Angelica Houston chewing up scenery, and you're like, oh, this still holds up pretty well. It's still pretty creepy. Which leads me to the problem that I have with this version. It's very bright. It's very colorful. It's very Robert Zemeckis. It's joyful. It's kiddie. It has the through line, and it feels like the Roald Dahl book. Like everything that's in that book is there. Even the ending, which I'll get on in a bit. It's all there, but it's more polished. It's not as gritty and grimy. And that CG, you can definitely tell when the CG is being used, and it looks very hokey. And it never really instills the fear or nerve or trepidation that you had when everything was more practical. This film, there's nothing wrong with this 2020 Witches, except for that it lacks the bite or spine of any of the original version of that film, the original film, the first adaptation. Anne Hathaway's great. She's the one thing that if you want the price of admission to watch this film, if you want to click on HBO Max, you keep seeing it and you're like, all right, fine, I'll finally watch this. If nothing else, she is worth seeing in this role. But outside of that, there's not really a lot happening with this movie versus watching the '90s version, which I just think is a much better product. I do like the addition or switching from using the family they used in the books and in the original film to using an African American family, having Chris Rock, even though you still get a bit of a everybody hates Chris feel from it. Having Chris Rock narrate, it feels good. You can tell that there's some things added that when you want to spice up for African American audiences. I think Kenya Barris helped write some of this and produce some of this. You can see where his touch comes in that. And for the start of this film, it has me. I'm a kid who lost a parent early, and so I kind of resonated with that. But the second we get to that hotel and we start doing everything, it just feels so much. It feels more like an ABC after school special version of The Witches as opposed to The Witches that we got originally. These Roald Dahl books are always creepy and live in a world where he's telling a story and telling a thing about kids, but putting them through some of the most tragic and terrible things humanly possible. And so I think for me, while everything still happens almost the same as the book and the original adaptation, it just feels like I'm watching someone make this for an audience that I don't necessarily think cares. And so this is a movie that is somewhere in between being very faithful to the book, but being also very light and colorful. And those two things don't actually match because a lot of the stuff that's in those Roald Dahl books are not light and or colorful. The one thing I will say that this movie does better than the original film is that it sticks the landing almost on the ending. The ending is tit for tat, sort of what happens in the book, where, spoilers for those who have not read the book, and close your ears if you don't want to know, the kids stay as mice. One of the kids parents rejects him and they just stay as mice and they kind of go on this hunt for all the other witches. That's actually what occurs in the book. And one of the things that Roald Dahl was, and then that the state was very upset about with the original. This, they did that correctly, but then they overlay it and do that whole sequence with a very cheerful song, which makes you take sort of the bite out of it. Like, this film does everything humanly possible to raise the stakes and say, oh, this is trepidation, this is scary, this is this, but make it feel so hokey and childlike that you kind of, there's never a moment, for those, put it this way, for those fans who like movies like Labyrinth or Willow, where it's like, yes, this is quote unquote technically for kids, but it's or even Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which Roald Dahl, it's technically for kids. There is something underlying happening here. You never feel that threat in this movie, and that's the biggest issue that I have with this version of The Witches. You never feel like it's a threat or that they're even in trouble. Even when they're turning the mice, you're like, well, they'll sing a song and dance and play a Michael Jackson tune over it, and everything will be fine. And you don't want that from this type of film. At least I don't. I know if you're playing this to like 5 to 6 year olds, sure, they might eat this up. But I think when you get to an older audience and they read this book and they want to watch a version of The Witches, I would say if your kid's older, go with the 90s version. If you're dealing with a 5 to 6 year old and you want to, say, teach them this or show them this, then sure, this is the way to go. But for me, on my scale of once is enough, play it again, Sam, or give me a time stone so I never had to think about this again, this is on the once is enough. I don't think this is a terrible movie. I just don't think it's a necessary film because it does not improve upon anything that the 90s version did other than the ending, which they even sort of F that up. So that's me. What are your thoughts? Have you seen it? Go ahead and leave your comments in the comments below. If you haven't, you can follow us on Twitter at HollywoodADI, or you can email us at HollywoodAlreadyDidIt@gmail.com. We also have a podcast by the same name that is on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere that plays podcasts. We're there. That show's sort of on a bit of a hold since, COVID, the world, there aren't movies releasing the way that they used to, so we don't really have as much to talk about on there. But we do have a sister show, a sister podcast called You Can't Do That Anymore, where we talk about some of the classic films like Back to the Future or Gone with the Wind, and we discuss what those films did back in the day and whether or not they can still get away with doing those type of things today. But, like always, I got my ticket. You got yours.